Insanity is a disease in of itself, and like any disease, it can spread. Seemingly subtle at first, the strong and studied mind will find it more resilient to the pull of the deranged and mad. But much like Alice in her journey through Neverland, when surrounded by madness on all sides, when there is no semblance of structure or uniformity, and when the very air itself is seemingly a hostile force that has no restraint, then how long before you yourself must match the madness around you just to stay sane? This is the question a single nurse asked when working at Crotus Print Asylum. Welcome back to the realm of the entity, a realm of horrid monsters, savage killers, and desperate victims who partake in a mad and endless game at the whim of a nameless, faceless entity who laughs at the fear, hopelessness, and death he orchestrates. However, not all survivors are mere victims, and not all killers are savage and bloodthirsty. Some are quite the opposite. Sally Smithson was one such victim turned killer. Sally was a lovely young woman who'd had a run of terrible misfortune. Sally had moved out into the country with her beloved husband Jack, intent on starting a family. Jack was a lumberjack, strong, dependable, and handsome. But one day, a terrible accident took his life, and Sally was left alone. Without a means to make money, she would surely starve, so she took a job meant for desperate people like her. A job as a nurse attendant at Crotus Print Asylum. An insane asylum that was understaffed and filled to the brim with madness. The inmates ran things there, and there was little to no order to be found. But Sally was a kind soul, and for the first few years she thought that perhaps some good could be done here. She could help these people. Cure them. But it was all a wasted effort. Sally became more and more uncomfortable at the asylum. The patients were hostile, dangerous, and completely unable to be cured. And unwilling in most cases. Hell, they didn't even have names. Only nicknames given by the staff. They were not people. They were animals, sick and depraved. Yet, she held back her rage and her tears, for there was work to be done. But over the years, one patient in particular became most horrifying but also engaging to Sally. Bound to her bed by leather straps, for if left to her own devices she would viciously claw at her own skin or try to kill some of the other patients, this woman was guilty of quite a few murders. She claimed that it was what was needed. She too was a doctor, but a doctor who cured the true diseases of mankind. The madness, the depraved, the disgusting. These creatures were the true masters of the asylum. They were the true disease of society, and for them there was only one cure. Sally didn't want to listen to this mad woman's ramblings, but the ramblings were beginning to make sense to her. They were beginning to sound rational. Finally, after asking the mad woman her secret poison she used to kill, she created some for herself, and her first victim would be the very woman who taught her how to make it. How horrified that bandaged woman must have been. How frightened must she have been to have the very tool of her trade used on her. Was she surprised? Was she confused? She shouldn't be. How ironic that she could not see in herself the very disease she could so easily see in others. Every detestable creature at this asylum was sick, and they would be cured, one by bloody one. And when the staff entered the asylum that next morning, they found 50 patients dead in their beds, some dead by poison, others by strangulation. Even 4 night staff were found slain. Only Sally remained, rocking back and forth, giggling and mumbling to herself like a patient. She was detained and put into an ambulance to go to the hospital, no one realizing that she could possibly be the culprit. The ambulance never made it to the hospital. The drivers were found dead. The ambulance wrecked on the side of the road. And Sally? Gone. Sally's story is one that I think fits the world of Dead by Daylight almost too well. She's as much a victim as she is a killer, pushed to the brink of madness by loss and by desperation and by being overwhelmed by it all. As Joker famously likes to put it, all it takes to push a sane man to insanity is one bad day. But in Sally's case, it was a bad 2 decades. 20 years of being subjugated to constant insanity and pain, both physically and mentally. It's hard to even think about. And in a strange way, that makes it even more impactful. Given that the nurse in-game levitates and passes through objects means that she's a ghost now. So at some point, Sally Smithson died. Perhaps from the ambulance crash, or maybe she killed herself. But what I do know is that the nurse is one of the most feared killers in the game for her power. But I don't fear her more than I do simply pity her. The promise of a happy life stripped from her to the point the only thing left was a soulless husk? Well, and then the mad ravings of an insane murderer filling that husk with insanity. It's tragic. The realm of the entity has become her Neverland. But everything is sick in Neverland, and the nurse is needed to cure the ill. Now let me start by saying a very obvious fact. I hate playing the nurse. Many call the nurse S tier for her ability, which granted is pretty awesome. She is a really strong killer. The nurse can charge up a blink, where she rapidly moves forward, passing through physical barriers as she does. And she can repeat this action as long as she has blinks to use. But once she runs out of blink, swings an attack, or pauses too long, she will enter a stunned state, which makes her lose track of her target and stops her dead in her tracks for up to 2 seconds. The problem is that knowing how far Nurse will go, how long you need to hold down her blink attack to get the right distance, timing your attack just right, and knowing that flashlights can cancel out your blink ability is all maddening. She can be the most deadly killer in the whole game, but her learning curve is ungodly steep. She's one of the only killers I tend to not even try because I just know I'll get bullied trying to figure her out. Not to say I can't get lucky from time to time. But most often it's pain, especially since she has the slowest movement speed of any killer, meaning you are required to master her blink ability just to even have a prayer of catching up to a survivor. That's why I admire really good nurse players. They're just incredible to me. I can't figure out how they're that good. I know that they had to have sunk a ton of hours into figuring out her power and how to use it right, whereas I'm sitting here wondering, hey, how'd I overshoot that? And oh man, how come I didn't go far enough on that? It's insane. Now the nurse, like all killers, comes with 3 unique perks: Stridor, Thanatophobia, and Nurse's Calling. Stridor increases the volume of all survivors' breathing and grunts of pain, making it easier to find them. And I find this perk mostly useless. I hardly ever notice if it's working, and given how hard it is for me to even hit survivors half the time as Nurse, I rarely even get to hear the grunts of pain from them. Thanatophobia, though, is kinda useful. For each survivor injured, hooked, or in the dying state, this causes a decrease in speed to all cleansing, sabotaging, and fixing actions. I do like this, as it can help slow down survivors a bit to let me catch up to them a little faster, but again, that requires me to actually hit them, and that's easier said than done. But Nurse's Calling, ooh, I like this perk, as do many killers. Nurse's Calling allows the killer to see the auras of any survivors performing a healing action within range of you. And nothing is more satisfying than hunting down a survivor only to see one hiding behind a rock healing themselves. This perk is awesome for new killers who need a bit of help in the hunt. Now, I want to make it clear, I don't hate the nurse, I just don't like playing as her, as I'm just not skilled enough to become adequate at playing her character. I still enjoy her lore, though. In fact, I think there's something poetic about it. We live every day of our lives walking what we think to be the sane and rational path. But how close to the line of insanity do we actually walk? How much pressure and how much time would it take to break a person? Because Sally Smithson wasn't deranged or insane, just a woman who wanted happiness, who wanted a family. But time and pressure applied to her for far too long, and that sweet woman with big dreams cracked under the weight. Now she stalks the fog of a realm far away from her country home, hunting down the sick and the demented. How long until her brand of madness eventually washes off on her very own victims? Because, you know, Sally was a survivor in her own way, having to survive for 20 long years in an asylum that slowly worked away at her mind and her soul, and now she's a monster. So how long until the survivors that she now stalks suffer from a really bad night? Food for thought. Thank you guys for joining me today in the fog, and I will see you next time.